Hi everyone, I am Amrita. Today we are going to discuss about the topic fragile land, control over the changing in the nature of use. In this entire presentation, we have tried our best to include all the important aspects about fragile land India. Let's start our presentation. The word fragile means vulnerable or sensitive. When something's delicate or frail, you can call it fragile, and both words stem from the Latin root fragilis, brittle or easily broken. Thus, fragile land that is sensitive to degradation when disturbed, such as with highly erodible soils, soils where salt can accumulate, and soil at high elevation. The concept of ecologically fragile land originated in common law. It denotes the right of the people at large over the land of another. A person who uses another person's land over a long number of years uninterruptedly has easement right over the land by way of easement. It is called easement by prescription. The former has no title to the land. His right is only to use the land of the latter. The latter's title to his land does not prevent the use of his land by the former by way of prescription. Right to way over the land of another is an example. Similarly, the right of the people in the ecologically fragile land, though they do not have title to the land, is an easementary right. It is called public trust easement. Originally, the concept of public trust easement had applied in the matter of navigable waters like rivers. It originated in Roman law. The concept found its way to English law and then to American law. The concept is now followed in almost all democratic countries in the world and is now part of customary international law. India has a countrywide network of protected areas including wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, and tiger reserves. Owing to the pressure of human habitation and infrastructure development projects, the eco-sensitive zone around such protected areas are shrinking and in some cases are near zero or absent. The eco-sensitive zones are envisaged as a cushion or shock absorbers for protected areas. They are supposed to act as the transition zone from areas of high protection to the less protection. The National Wildlife Action Plan 2002 to 2016 have identified them as vital ecological corridor links and stressed that they must be protected to prevent isolation of fragment of biodiversity. The concept of the eco-sensitive zones around protected areas had first taken shape in January 2002, even during the meeting of the Indian Board for Wildlife. A strategy was adopted that held that areas within 10 kilometers radius of the protected area should be declared as eco-fragile zones and activities should be regulated in such areas. However, the state had raised concern against the 10-kilometer criteria, stating that this would end up covering all major human habitation and cities and would adversely affect the development. Subsequently, in 2005, it was decided that identification of eco-sensitive zones are around protected areas would be site-specific and would work on the principle of regulation rather than prohibition of activities. Over the years, the number of protected areas have also gone up in the country. At present, the number of protected areas is over 660 and together they count for less than 5% of India's total geographical area. The eco-sensitive zone of the protected areas are finalized by an expert committee of the Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, wherein the eco-sensitive zone proposal presented by state government are discussed and fine-tuned. Now we are looking to the main or basic element of this topic, that is what is ecologically fragile land. Without knowing this, we can't discuss more about fragile land. Ecologically fragile land means areas which containing natural, ecologic, scientific or aesthetic resources that could be significantly damaged by surface coal mining operation. In other words, those lands or water areas containing ecosystem, possibly but not necessarily rare, that are sensitive or external stimuli which may disturb their balance, especially in an irreversible direction. Examples for fragile lands include valuable habitats for fish or wildlife, critical habitats for endangered or threatened species of animals or plants, uncommon geologic formation, paleontological sites, national natural landmarks, areas where mining may result in flooding, environmental corridors containing a concentration of ecologic and aesthetic features, and areas of recreational value due to high environmental quality. In India, eco-sensitive zones or ecologically fragile areas are areas notified by the Ministry of India, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India around protected areas, national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. They are regulated by the central government through the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Heritage sites, forests, national parks, biosphere reserves, wildlife sanctuaries, lakes, wetlands, mangrove forests, coral reefs, areas with specialized skill, tribal areas, areas of tourist interest, archaeological monuments, etc. are included in the eco-sensitive zone. The Environmental Protection Act 1986 does not mention the word eco-sensitive zone. However, Section 32V of the Act says that central government can restrict areas in which any industries, operations or process or class of industries, operations or process shall not be carried out or shall be carried out subject to certain safeguards. Besides, Rule 5.1 of the Environment Protection Rule 1986 states that central government can prohibit or restrict the location of industries and carrying on certain operations or process on the basis of consideration like the biological diversity of an area, maximum allowable limits of concentration of pollutants for an area, environmentally compatible land use, and proximity to protected areas. The above two clauses have been effectively used by the government to declare eco-sensitive zone or eco-fragile zones. The same criteria have been used by the government to declare no development zone. Time to time, the Ministry of Time to time, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change approves a comprehensive set of guidelines laying down parameters and criteria for declaring eco-sensitive zones. A committee constituted by Ministry of Environment and Forest put this together. The guidelines lay out the criteria based on which areas can be declared as eco-sensitive zones. These include species-based, ecosystem-based, geomorphologic features space, etc. Now we can look to some eco-fragile zones in India. Forest. The country has a total forest cover of 7.7 lakh square kilometers, of which 3.99 is classified as reforest and 2.38 as protected, and unclassified forest area is spread over 1.3 lakh square kilometers as per the State Forest Report 2003. The thrust of our forest policy is on protection, conservation and development of forests. Mangroves. Specialized forest ecosystem of tropical and subtropical regions bordering the sheltered sea, coastal and estuaries. Mangroves stabilize the shoreline and act as barriers against encroachment by the sea. Salt-tolerant interdictyl halophytic plants dominate mangrove forests. At present, India has about 4,461 square kilometers under mangrove forest, which is about 0.14% of the world's total mangrove area. Biosphere reserves. 12 multi-purpose protected areas which preserve the genetic diversity in representative ecosystem have been set up. These biosphere reserves are in the Nilgiris, Nanda Devi, Nokret, Great Nicobar, Gulf of Mannar, Manas, Sundarban, Simphil, Dibru Shikwa, Panch, Marhi, Dibang, Dibang and Kanchenjunga. Comprehensive guidelines have been prepared for eco-development projects, development of database, conservation plans of key species, and establishment of research stations. Wetlands. Transitional areas between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystem where the water table is usually at or near the surface include marshes, swamps, floodplains, bogs, peatlands, shallow ponds, littoral zones or large water bodies, tidal marshes, etc. The Ministry of Environment and Forest estimates that the country possesses about 4.1 million hectares of wetlands, including paddy fields and mangroves, of which 1.5 million hectares are natural and 2.6 million hectares are man-made. Coral reefs, shallow water tropical marine ecosystem characterized by remarkably high biomass production, rich fauna-floral diversity, and a structure formed by calcareous skeleton that houses corals is categorized as a coral reef. The Andaman Nicobar and the Lakshadweep Islands contain some of the finest coral formation in India, apart from the reefs that are found in Gulf of Kutch and the Gulf of Mannar. A national level strategy for conservation of corals and coral reefs has been formulated to preserve these fragile marine ecosystems presently deteriorating rapidly. Coastal areas. Under the Environment Protection Act 1986, a notification on coastal zone regulation has been issued declaring coastal structures of seas or bays, estuaries, creeks, rivers, and backwaters within 500 meters of high tide line as coastal regulation zone. Setting up of new industries or expansion of existing industries, expecting those directly related to waterfront manufacturing, handling, storage or disposal of hazardous substances, and setting up of unit for disposal of waste, etc. are prohibited within the coastal regulation zones. Tribal areas. The heterogeneous population of India is composed of diverse biological, culture, and linguistic heritage. For instance, there are about 250 identifiable communities in northeast India alone. Among various other clans and castes, tribal peoples deserve special protection. Environmental protection is a serious issue for tribal districts and special permission need to be procured from local administrative body for setting up large-scale industries within the tribal areas. Natural hazard prone area. Certain areas of our countries are more prone to natural hazards like earthquakes, cyclones, drought, floods, and tsunamis. Of the country's total geographical area of 328 million hectares, 40 million hectares have been assessed as prone to floods, out of which 32 million hectares can be taken as protectable. So far, 14.4 million hectares have been provided with a reasonable degree of flood protection. Several commissions and boards have been set up to prepare comprehensive flood mitigation measures. Next is archaeological monuments. Our country is a grand repository of ancient cultural treasures. Prehistoric and protohistoric remains have been excavated from many parts of the country. Of the historical period, ruins of monuments dating back to 500 BC still exist. All these monuments and more need to be protected from a deteriorating environment which hastens their decimation. The Archaeological Survey of India is the apex body for preservation of historical monuments. So the last one is World Heritage Sites. There are altogether 290 World Heritage Sites, cultural as well as natural wonders. Out of these, India has 15 cultural and 5 natural heritage sites. The International Council of Monuments and Sites, a wing of UNESCO, has declared April 18 of every year as World Heritage Day. The Department of Culture and Archaeological Survey of India observes this World Heritage Day and implements various practical measures in respect of conservation of the World Heritage Monuments. So that's all about my topic. Hope you can understand. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ardra. So, the part that I'm going to discuss is about the customary laws and some important international conventions regarding the conservation of ecological fragile land. So, what I'm going to focus on is about some important elements regarding the customary laws and some very important international conventions in relation to the conservation and protection of our ecological fragile land in our country. So, let's get to it. The law relating to ecological fragile land arises also from the customary international law. That is, the rule relating to customary international law is derived from the consistent conduct of states acting on the belief that the law is required to act in that particular way. And during the seventh decade of 20th century onwards, global community have started realizing the importance of preserving our environment and ecology. And from this newborn realization, various environmental common law has emerged. That is, in other words, we can say it is now widely recognized that problems relating to environmental pollution and ecological degradation is not simply a problem relating to any particular country or territory, but it's a problem of the whole world, okay, as a whole. So, a common agenda was therefore necessary to contain the problems caused by pollution, that is, global warming, disappearance of glaciers, degradation of forests, etc. Caused, and all these caused, widespread disaster repercussions of which are far reaching and cut across the state boundaries. Now, looking into the elements of the customary international law, we can look at as one is widespread repetition by states of similar international act over time. Second is the act must occur out of a sense of obligation. Third is act must be taken by a significant number of states and not rejected by a significant number of states. Now, most of these rules that have been mentioned in the previous slides are now codified and are now become international agreements and conventions. So here we are going to discuss about the most important international conventions regarding the ecological fragile lands. The first one is Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. Second one is Convention on Biological Diversity. Third is Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage. Fourth one is UNESCO's Man and Biosphere Program. So, of course, India is a signatory to all these conventions and programs, and therefore India is duty bound to implement the provisions of these conventions. Moreover, most of these conventions, as I have mentioned before, have been read into a domestic law by a Supreme Court. For example, the Supreme Court in the case of TNG Thirumalpad versus Union of India, the judgment was given in 2002. Here the court held that Convention on Biodiversity, which we are going to discuss in detail in later, is now part of our domestic law, and therefore it can be seen that the states have a duty to implement the international conventions not only under our customary international law but also under the law of the Supreme Court, which in view of Article 141 of our Constitution of India, which is Constitution of India is considered as the law of the land. So now let us look into the first convention, that is Ramsar Convention of 1971. So the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, that is the actual name, and that we commonly call it as Ramsar Convention. It is an international agreement promoting the conservation and sustainable use of our wetlands. And this convention is named after the city of Ramsar in Iran, where it was signed on 2nd of February of 1971. And this convention is the only global treaty to focus on a single ecosystem. And as of May 2021, in this convention there are about 171 contracting parties, that is member countries, and that covers over 2,400 designated sites. Now through this agreement, the member countries have positively committed to, first one is wise use of all their wetlands, second one is designating sites for the Ramsar list of wetlands of international importance, or what we commonly called as the Ramsar sites, and for their conservation. Third is cooperation on the transboundary wetlands and other shared interest. So these wetlands on the Ramsar list that we see are designated for their high value to the country and the world, for their ecosystem services and the benefits that are provided by these wetlands. And these Ramsar sites, they are designated by the National Administrative Authority, and for that it has to meet some kind of particular technical criteria and all are there. And according to the World Wide Fund of India, wetlands are one of the most threatened of all ecosystems in India. Okay, and as of 2021, there are about 46 recognized Ramsar sites in India, and 3 of them are in Kerala. They are Ashtamudi wetland, second is Shastam Kota Lake, third is Vembanad Court wetland. Now, looking into the next this slide, I hope you can see a map of India. Where this is the map that showing the Ramsar wetland sites in India. The 46 Ramsar wetland sites in India, and here we can see the three of them in Kerala: the Vembanad, Ashtamudi, and Shastankota, and all other wetlands are spread across all over the India. And these wetlands are considered as the most threatened ecosystems in India. And the further details, that is the entire list of the 46 Ramsar wetland sites and the other related reports, you can get all those details if you look into the Ministry of Environment and Forest of our Government of India. Now let us look into the second convention, that is Convention on Biological Diversity of 1992. This is an internationally legally binding treaty with three main goals. What are they? First one is conservation of our biodiversity. Second is sustainable use of biodiversity. And third is the fair and equitable sharing of resources. So this in this we can simply say that the overall objective of this convention is to encourage actions from the member countries which would lead for creating a sustainable future. Now, this convention mandates the parties, that is the member countries, to conserve our biological diversity by in situ and ex situ conservation. So, let us look at what is meant by in situ conservation. In situ conservation means it is the conservation of ecosystems and natural habitats and the maintenance and recovery of population species and their natural surroundings. That is, the importance here is it is related to the natural surroundings of all these species and the ecosystems and all. Whereas in the case of ex situ conservation, it is defined as the conservation of biological components outside their natural habitat. So there is a difference. The other one is in the natural surroundings. Ex situ is in the case of outside the natural habitat. Now, Article 8 of this convention mandates that every contracting party has to establish protected area or areas where special needs to be taken care. For what? For first is to conserve their biological diversity. Second is to rehabilitate and restore degraded ecosystems. Third is to promote the recovery of threatened species. This Article 8 also mandates that the contracting parties to develop and maintain necessary legislations or other kind of other regulatory provisions that are needed for the protection of threatened species and populations of this area. Now, the ex situ conservation under Article 9 of the conservation, the ex situ conservation says that it mandates that every contracting party is to adopt measures for the ex situ conservation of components of biological diversity, and also to adopt measures for the recovery and rehabilitation of threatened species and for the reintroduction into the natural habitats under appropriate conditions. Now, let us look into the third one, that is Convention concerning the protection of World Cultural and Natural Heritage of 1972. This was adopted in 1972 by the General Conference of UNESCO. Basically, what this convention is about is promoting an international perspective on cultural heritage by inviting the member countries to submit an inventory, or simply we can say list of properties forming its national, cultural and natural heritage to be included in the list of World Heritage Sites. We all have heard about the list of World Heritage Sites, right? So, India is a dignitary to this convention, and therefore it is a duty to carry out the provisions of this convention. Now, this convention has clearly defined what is meant by natural heritage. So here we can look in the slide, we can see it. Natural heritage means natural features consisting of physical and biological formations or groups of such formations which are of outstanding universal value from the aesthetic or scientific point of view, and also geological and physiographical formations and precisely delineated areas which constitute the habitat of threatened species of animals and plants of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science or conservation. So in India, Western Ghat is considered as one such natural heritage, and thus it has been included in the list of World Heritage Sites, and therefore our Government of India has a duty to protect the Western Ghats and conserve and preserve its biodiversity under the customary international law. Now, under Article 4 of this convention, every contracting party, that is every member country, has a duty to ensure the identification, protection, conservation, presentation and transmission to future generations of what? Of this cultural and natural heritages situated in each and every in their own territory. And as of 27th July 2021, there are about 40 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in India. And Dholavira and Ramappa Temple are the latest addition to the list, and they have been added to the UNESCO's World Heritage Sites under the category of cultural category. And there are some other few sites have been included, and that is how it have become 46 Ramsar sites, and some other in the tentative list of World Heritage Sites in India. Now let us look into the last convention, that is UNESCO's Man and Biosphere Program. Commonly we call it as MAB program. This is simply an intergovernmental program or intergovernmental scientific program that aims to establish a scientific basis for enhancing the relationship between people and their environment. And we have all heard about biosphere reserves, right? So these biosphere reserves are simply areas of territorial and coastal ecosystems which are internationally recognized within the framework of UNESCO's Man and Biosphere program. So these reserves, in order to declare a ecosystem as biosphere reserve, they are required to meet a minimal set of criteria, and they have to adhere to a minimal set of conditions before they have been admitted into the World Network Biosphere Reserve designated by the UNESCO for inclusion in the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. Now the World Network of Biosphere Reserves currently it has 714 sites covering 129 countries all over the world, including 21 transboundary sites. For example, we can say Agastyamelli Biosphere Reserve is one such example of biosphere reserves included in the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. And this reserve, Agastyamelli Biosphere Reserve consists of three zones mainly: core zone, buffer zone, and transition zone. And this biosphere, its total area is about 3,500 square kilometers, and out of this 1,828 square kilometers is in Kerala, and the balance is in Tamil Nadu. And in this 1,828 square kilometers in Kerala, it is as follows. That is, the core zone we can see is about 352 square kilometers, buffer zone is about 691 square kilometers, and transition zone is 785 square kilometers. So we already discussed what is core zone, what is buffer zone, and transition zone, and we later on in the coming presentations it will be discussed in detail. So these are the mainly four conventions, the important four conventions that are related to the conservation of sustainable use of our ecological fragile lands in the world. And of course, since India is a part of most of these conventions, India has to enforce and implement the provisions of all these conventions. So that's it.
Hi, I'm Devika. The topics which I'll be presenting are National Forest Policy and the important judgments related to the our main topic, which is ecologically fragile lands and the issues related to it. And the important judgments which I'll be discussing on are first one is Government of Kerala versus Jacob Thomas Arikuppuram. Second one is Conservator and Custodian of Forest and ORS versus Shobha John Koshi and ANR. Third one is T.N. Godavarman Thirumalpad versus Union of India. The fourth one is S. Muhammad Ismail versus State of Kerala and others. Finally, the State of Kerala versus Unnikrishnan. To begin with, the National Forest Policy. So, India is one of the few countries which has a forest policy since 1894. This policy was revised in 1952 and again in 1988. Now, the independent India had different goals and priorities from forests. So, the National Forest Policy, which is existing still today, is that of the 1988, which is formulated in 1988. Now, the National Forest Policy was revised in 1998 with several changes in how forest management was to be approached. Now, the basic objectives of National Forest Policy were that the maintenance of environmental stability through preservation, conserving the natural heritage of the country by preserving the remaining natural forests, checking soil erosion and denudation in the catchment areas of rivers, lakes, reservoirs, checking the extension of sand dunes in the desert areas, increasing substantially the forest or tree cover in the country through massive afforestation, meeting the requirements of fuel wood, fodder, minor forest produce, and small timber of the rural and tribal populations, increasing the productivity of forests to meet essential national needs, and encouraging efficient utilization of forest produce and maximizing substitution of wood, and finally creating a massive people's movement with the involvement of women. The four essentials of forest management of National Forest Policy were that the existing forest and forest lands should be fully protected and their productivity improved. Diversion of good and productive agricultural lands to forestry should be discouraged. The conservation of total biological diversity. And finally, minor forest produce should be protected, improved, and their production enhanced. The different strategies are as follows. to begin with the first one, area under forest. The national goal should be to have a minimum of 1/3 of the total land area of the country under forest or tree cover. Second one, the afforestation, social forestry and farm forestry. It is necessary to encourage the planting of trees alongside of roads, railway lines, rivers, and streams and canals, and also on other unutilized lands. And the village and community lands not required for other productive uses should be taken up for the development of tree crops and fodder resources. Also, the land law should be so modified wherever necessary so as to facilitate and motivate individuals and institutions to undertake tree farming and grow fodder plants and grasses on their own land. Now, the third point, which is the management of state forest. The new forest should be permitted to be worked without the government having approved the management plan, which should be in a prescribed format and in keeping with the national forest policy. Also, in order to meet the growing needs for essential goods and services which the forests provide, it is necessary to enhance forest cover and productivity of the forest through the application of scientific and technical inputs. Now, the fourth point, which is the rights and concessions. The rights and concessions should always remain related to the carrying capacity of forest. The life of tribals and other poor living within and near forest revolves around forest, so they should be fully protected. Similar consideration should be given to the scheduled caste and other poor living near the forest. Now, the fourth point, diversion of forest lands for non-forest purposes. The forest land or land with tree cover should not be treated merely as a resource readily available to be utilized for various projects and programs, but as a national asset which requires to be properly safeguarded for providing sustained benefits to the entire community. And the beneficiaries who are allowed mining and quarrying in forest land and in land covered by trees should be required to repair and revegetate the area in accordance with the established forestry practices. Now, the fifth one, wildlife conservation. So, the forest management should take special care of the needs of wildlife conservation and forest management plans, which should include prescription for this purpose. Now, the next one is the tribal people and forest. So, some of the, while safeguarding the customary rights and interests of such people, forestry programs should pay special attention to the following. One is that a protection, regeneration, and optimal collection of minor forest produce. Then the development of forest villages on par with revenue villages. Then family-oriented schemes for improving the status of the tribal beneficiaries. Now, next one is the shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation is affecting the environment and productivity of land. So, area already damaged by such cultivation should be rehabilitated through social forestry and energy plantations. Now, the eighth one is the damage to forest from encroachments, fires, and grazing. So, for this, there should be no regularization of existing encroachments, and the incidence of forest fires is high in the country. So, improved and modern management practices should be adopted to deal with forest fires. Also, grazing in forest areas should be regulated with the involvement of the community. And now, the ninth one is the forest-based industries. So, as far as possible, a forest-based industry should raise the raw material needed for meeting its own requirement. Then, no forest-based enterprise except that at the village or cottage level should be permitted in the future, unless it has been cleared after careful scrutiny. The forest-based industries must not only provide employment to local people on priority, but also involve them fully in raising trees and raw materials. The practice of supply of forest produce to industry at concessional prices should cease. The farmers, particularly small and marginal ones, would be encouraged to grow on marginal degraded lands available with them. Also, the national forests, they will not therefore be made available to industries. Now, the 10th one, which is the forest extension, education, and research. So, the next one is forest survey and database. So, here, inadequacy of data regarding the forest resources is a matter of concern because this creates a false sense of complacency. So, priority needs to be accorded to the completing the survey of forest resources in the country on scientific lines and to updating information. So finally, financial support for forestry. So the objectives of this revised policy cannot be achieved without the investment of financial and other resources on a substantial scale. So they are a national asset to be protected and enhanced for the well-being of the people and the nation. The major achievements of the policy are increase in the forest and tree cover, involvement of local communities in the protection, conservation and management of the forest through joint forest management program, conservation of biological diversity and genetic resources of the country, and a significant contribution towards the maintenance of ecological balance and environmental stability in the country. So to conclude, the first national forest policy in independent India came into effect in 1952. So thereafter in 1988, a new version of the national forest policy came into being. And the latest version has been in the offing for nearly 4 years now, but a final version is yet to be made public. And this new forest policy, which is actually significant, much required now, and it is expected to consider the changes that have come into laws that deal with forest, climate change, pollution, and other pressing requirements of the present times. Getting into our second topic, which is the important judgments. So to begin with the first case law, which is the Government of Kerala versus Jacob Thomas Arikapuram, which is dated 6 December 2007. Now, the facts of the case, in a nutshell, are that a scheduled property measuring 77.50 acres, which was in a village in Kozhikode Taluk, originally belonged to Arikampura Thomas, father of the applicants. So, on the death of their father Thomas, respondents derived the title. The respondents contended that they planted coffee in the property and obtained a registration certificate. While they were holding the property in title and possession, the forest department made a claim that it was a private forest and it vested in the government under Section 3(1) of the Vesting Act. So while the applicants were carrying on agricultural operations in the application under scheduled property, the DFO Kozhikode issued a notice under Section 3(2) of the EFL Act, informing the respondents that the property had been notified as ecologically fragile land vested in the government. So thereupon, the respondents filed a writ petition praying for an order to compel the state and its officers to denotify the land. The court actually dismissed the writ petition. Thereafter, a three-member inspection committee was constituted and they inspected the application scheduled property without giving notice to the respondents and resulting in a submission of a report. Again, the custodian passed an order declaring that the application scheduled property is an ecologically fragile land vested in the government. So then again the applicants filed another writ petition. Later tribunal further declared that the application scheduled property covered by the notification referred to in its order is not an ecologically fragile land. So the decision made by the court was that the court found it difficult to agree with the case of the respondents that the land in question is a coffee plantation, and also found that the respondents did not produce any reliable evidence to substantiate their contention. So and also the ultimate decision by the tribunal was also found to be unsustainable. So in the result, the appeal is allowed. So the application filed by the respondents is devoid of any merit and hence it is dismissed. So the land is termed to be an ecologically fragile land. So the second case is Conservator and Custodian of Forest and Oils versus Shobhajan Koshi and ANF. The facts of this case are as follows. The land which is subject matter of this appeal, along with other land situated at Pannu Valley in Wayanad, Kerala, was said to be vested in government under the Kerala Private Forest Act 1971. So the respondents with their predecessor filed the application in the Forest Tribunal for declaration that the lands were not vested forest. The tribunal rejected the claim, which the matter was taken to the High Court. The High Court remanded the matter to the tribunal for fresh determination. So after prolonged litigation, the judgment of the Forest Tribunal was set aside, declaring that land not vested in the government on the appointed date under Act 1971. So after the above judgment of the High Court, it was incumbent upon the custodian to restore back the possession of the land, but the land could not be restored due to one or the other reasons. One of such reasons were that the Adivasis were in possession of the land who could not be dispossessed by the state. So a proposal was submitted by the DFO that instead of restoration of the land, compensation be paid to the landowners whose land could not be restored. And the respondents expressed their agreements to receive compensation. And later, a writ petition was filed by the respondents in the High Court, praying that either they may be restored the original land or they may be paid compensation as assessed by the district tehsildar. So for which the Conservator of Forest and other state authorities were aggrieved by the judgment, and they filed a writ appeal, but which was dismissed by the division bench later. So the decision in this case was that hence the bench held that the respondents were to be granted compensation to the extent of 50% of value of the land as computed by the Tehsildar, which was to be paid within 3 months. Further, the interest of 7% per annum was awarded in case of default. The third and one of the most important case, which is T.N. Godavarman Thirumalpad versus Union of India. Actually, this landmark case is also known as the forest case in India. It was regarding the control and supervision of the forest of India. The main highlight of this case was that it was to conserve the forest. The petitioner has highlighted that the respondents have in collusion with certain vested interest allowed trespassers to encroach and enter upon the forest land for the purpose of felling trees and conversion of forest land into plantations. So, the petitioner has pleaded that the destruction of rainforest would adversely affect the environment, ecosystem, the plants and animals living within the forest. So the petitioner also highlighted that although the national policy has provided that 33% of the landmass of India shall be covered with forest, the present extent of the forest covered area was below 15%. So the issues discussed were whether the new interpretation of Section 2 of the Forest Conservation Act and forest land is violative and whether the usage of timber for commercial purpose is justified. So the outcome of the T.N. Godavarman Thirumalpad witnesses the decline and the closure of numerous timber industries. It also created environment awareness among the citizens of India. It prohibited deforestation strictly. This case has acted as a stimulus in environmental conservation and protection on a large scale. So the main contribution of the case was the efficient and smooth operation of various laws in carrying out the environmental activities. Now the next case is S. Muhammad Ismail versus State of Kerala and others. In this case, the appellant's father, late A. Sulaiman Rautar, was the owner and was in possession and enjoyment of a plantation known as Orompari Estate in Palakkad district, and the total extent of which was 550 acres. So, on the implementation of the Kerala Private Forest Act 1971, the estate was notified as a private forest vested in the state. But later, the 530 acres was declared to be not a private forest. But in as far as the remaining 20 acres of the estate is concerned, the tribunal held that it being reserved as shared area continued to be a private forest within the meaning of the Act 26 of 1971. Now, the respondents filed MFA in the court challenging the order of the tribunal. The court actually dismissed the appeal, but they filed a review petition. The court allowed the review. And later on, in the light of all these orders and judgments, though 30 acres of land which was held to be a plantation should have been restored to its owners, but that was not done. And thereafter, later, 214.4830 hectares of land was, which is a part of Mudalmada village of Chittoor Taluk, was restored to its owners. Then, according to the appellant, since then, the appellant and the co-owners were in possession and enjoyment of the property. But subsequently, under Ordinance 8 of 2000, the 462.10 acres out of the 530 acres was notified as ecologically fragile land. So it was in this background the writ petition was filed challenging the notification, and the court directed the respondents not to dispossess the appellant under further orders. So, and the facts of this case of the appellant are entirely similar to the facts considered in Kumari Verma's case. Now, so the respondents do not even claim to have maintained the plantation during the intervening 26 years when it was in the custody and control of the state. So therefore, the natural growth that has occurred in the land during this period cannot be made use of now by the state to contend that the plantation has become a forest. So the respondent also do not have a case that the land has become a forest during the period when it was restored to the owners, and thereof is an ecologically fragile land as defined in Act 21 of 2005. In such circumstances, we are absolutely certain that such a land cannot, in the light of the facts noticed and the principles laid down by the court in Kumari Verma's case, be notified as an ecologically fragile land as defined under Act 21 of 2005 to vest under Section 3 thereof. So, in the aforesaid circumstances, the appellant is entitled to succeed. The final case law is the state of Kerala versus Unnikrishnan. So here, the land involved in this appeal was originally declared by the custodian of private forest by notification in the Gazette as a private forest vested in the government under the Kerala Private Forest Act 1971. So the respondent challenged this said notification before the Forest Tribunal, and the tribunal held that the land is a private forest but eligible for exemptions. So, pursuant to the said judgment, the land in question was restored to the respondent. Subsequently, when the EFL Act came into force, the appellants published a notification declaring that the land in question vests with the government as an ecologically fragile land. So, the respondent filed the OA before the EFL tribunal and contending that the land in question is not an ecologically fragile land. So, after taking evidence, the tribunal concluded that the land in question does not answer the definition of ecologically fragile land under Section 2, subsection B, clause 1 of the Act. And so that order of the tribunal is under challenge in this appeal, the instance of the state and the custodian of ecologically fragile. So in this case, the evidence available on record eminently supports the conclusion that all the three ingredients to constitute the land as an ecologically fragile land is fully satisfied. Accordingly, the impugned order of the tribunal is set aside and the original application is dismissed, upholding the notification issued under Section 3, Clause 1 of the EFL Act, and holding that the land covered by the notification under challenge in the original application is ecologically fragile land as defined in the Section 2, subsection B, clause 1 of the EFL Act. Thank you.
This act aims at transferring to and vesting in the government the ownership and possession of all ecological fragile lands held by any person in order to minimize the degradation of the ecosystem and their biological diversity. The government shall have the right to declare any land to be ecological fragile land, which shall be deemed to be resumed reserve forest according to the provision of this Act. The Act provides for the condition and functions of an advisory committee which shall be responsible for identifying ecological fragile lands. Whereas the Earth's biological resources with their intrinsic ecological, genetic, economic, social, cultural, scientific, educational, recreational, and aesthetic values are global assets, and public trust vital to the sustained economic and social development, maintenance of ecological balance, and the very existence of humanity. Whereas the fundamental requirement for the conservation of biological diversity is the conservation of ecosystem and natural habitats, and the maintenance and recovery of viable population as species in their natural surroundings. Tropical forest in the Western Ghats, which has been declared a biodiversity hotspot, by the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources are very rich repositories of biodiversity, extremely susceptible to rapid irreversible degradation, where it has become inevitable to conserve effectively ecologically fragile lands, minimizing the reduction of degradation of these ecosystems and biological diversity therein, which evolved through millions of years. Consider necessary to manage such lands in integrated and uniform manner within their ecological boundaries in accordance with the management plans based on sound scientific principles. The Act was passed by the state legislature and notified on 6th June 2005. Section 1 Clause 2 further provided that the Act shall be deemed to have come into force on 2nd day of June 2000. The Act also received the assent of the President of India on 25 April 2005. The 2003 Act has been enacted to provide for the vesting in the government of the ecological fragile land and for the management of such lands with a view to maintaining ecological balance and conserving the biodiversity. The provisions of the Act do not indicate that any of the provisions has been enacted with a view to bring any agrarian reform. Ecologically fragile land vests in the state and is managed by the Forest Department as per the management plan. Ecological fragile land. Section 2B of the 2003 Act defines the ecological fragile land. It consists of two categories of land. The first category is any forest land held by any person subject to the condition that such land is lying contiguous to or encircled by either reserved or vested forest or any other forest land owned by the government. The expression person occurring under section 2B subdivided by I must necessarily be understood as a person other than the state, whether natural or juridical, for the same simple reason under the scheme of the Act. Such lands are eventually stand transferred to and visiting the state. Further, such land predominantly supports natural vegetation. The second category is any land declared to be an ecological fragile land by the government by notification in the Gazette under section 4. Ecological fragile land are those land which are qualified for being a forest and are lying contiguous to a reserved forest or vested forest or when any other land owned by government in supporting natural vegetation. It does not include any land which is used principally for the cultivation of crops of long duration such as cardamom, pepper, tea, arachid, coconut, or any other size. For a land to be ecologically fragile land, the precondition is that it should be predominantly supporting natural vegetation. Ecologically fragile land to be deemed to be reserved forest constituted under the Kerala Forest Act 1961. Vesting of ecological fragile land under the 2003 Act is done in two ways. The first is the 2003 Act vests the ownership and possession of ecological fragile land held by any person in the state with the government. This transfer shall be free from all encumbrances and the right, title and interest of the owner or any other person shall stand extinguished from the said date. The land vested in the government under Section 3 Clause 1 shall be notified in the Gazette, and the ownership shall be informed in writing by the custodian, and notification shall be placed before the advisory committee constituted under Section 15 for purpose. The aforesaid vesting is automatically by operation of law. The vesting of the above land is as per the definition under Section 2 Clause B and 2 Clause C of the Act. Such land which is vested under Section 3 is an identifiable land by contiguity with the reserve and vested forest. For land which is encircled by reserve forest and vested forest, exercise of declaring and notifying any land which is not contiguous under Section 3 Clause 2 may be incorrect exercise of power by the authorities, which can be corrected by machinery provided in law, but that can be a ground to declare the invalidity of statute. Secondly, the government shall have power to declare by notification in the Gazette any land to be ecological fragile land on the recommendation of advisory committee appointed for the purpose under Section 15 of this Act. Unlike Section 3, declaration of any land as ecological fragile land requires a 30-day notice to the owner of the land. Only in respect of such land, the declaration and notification as provided for in Section 4 is required before it being vested. In other words, the land which is statutorily meant as ecological fragile land does not need a further declaration by way of notification. The land which is covered by Section 4 notification is within the power vested in the government to declare any land as ecological fragile land after receiving recommendation of the advisory committee. Under Section 15 of the Ad High Power Committee has been constituted, consisting of Principal, Chief Conservator of Forest, Secretary of the Forest Department, and other experts on the subject. The 1971 Act versus the 2003 Act. Some observation in Planters Forum versus State of Kerala. The 2003 Act has been enforced with effect from 2nd June 2000, and vesting of ecological fragile land in the state shall deemed to have been taken place on 2nd June 2000. The ecological fragile land, as defined in the 2003 Act under Section 2 Clause B, read with Section 2 Clause C, is of a particular category of land. There cannot be any assumption that the land which had already been vested with the state has again to be vested in the state of 2nd June 2000. The relevant date for vesting of ecological fragile land under Section 3 being entirely different from vesting of private forest under the 1971 Act or exemption from private forest as on 10th May 1971 are two distinct and different happenings and events. The non-obstant clause in Section 3 Clause 1 is to give overriding effect to Section 3 Clause 1 despite any judgment, decree, or order of tribunal. The judgments rendered in the context of the 1971 Act were on a different operation of law and the definition of ecological fragile land. Being different from private forest under the Act 1971 Act. Section 3 Clause 1 of the Act can in no manner be faulted. The judgment and decree or order which is referred to in Section 3 Clause 1 of the 2003 Act are obviously judgment, decree or order which were rendered prior 2nd June 2000. The 2003 Act envisaged a definition of the concept that is ecological fragile land and gave the overriding effect to overriding judgment or order is fully covered the valid legislation and Section 3 Clause 1 cannot be treated to be legislation overriding the judgment rendered on the 1971 Act. Eco-sensitive zones. Eco-sensitive zones means the fragile area that exists within 10 kilometers of protected areas like national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. The purpose of marking an eco-sensitive zone is to create a kind of shock absorber around the protected areas. The eco-sensitive zones around protected areas are declared by Ministry of Environmental, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India. The MEFCC's draft notification of considering eco-sensitive zone around Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary is highly opposed by people in As per the draft notification, the proposed ESZ around Wayanad As per the draft notification, the proposed eco-sensitive zone around Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary will include an area of 180.59 km, out of which 90% of this area largely consists of human settlements. This includes 8.89 km Tirunelli Reserve Forest and 17.67 km of Chadalayadu Range, and both are rich in biodiversity. The prohibited activities around eco-sensitive zones are commercial mining, stone quarrying, crushing units, setting up industries that cause pollution, establishment of hydroelectric projects, commercial use of firewood, solid waste disposal or wastewater disposal, and many other activities are prohibited or banned around eco-sensitive zones. The challenges for setting up eco-sensitive zones and needy development activities, such as construction of dams, roads, urban and rural infrastructure in eco-sensitive zone, create interference, negatively impact upon the environment, and imbalance the ecological system. For example, construction of road would lead to cutting down of trees, which would further impact upon soil erosion, thereby destroying the habitats of the species preserved under the ecosensitive zones, giving more impetus to afforestation and reforestation, degraded forest, regeneration of lost habitats, reducing climate change impacts by promoting carbon footprints through education, etc., propagating conservation techniques, and creating awareness about over exploitation of resources and its adverse impact among masses, governments, civil societies, and stakeholders are largely required to collaborate with each other for balancing sustainable development with development.
So the next topic that comes under this very subject is changes in land use from colonial period to present. And my name is Meena Elizabeth Anthony. To come into the subject, we can see that despite the availability of a wide range of tools for measuring and explaining the changes in land cover and the land use, it is very difficult and extremely challenging to measure the same when it comes to tropical regions, and Kerala is a biodiversity hotspot. With a high population density and a long history of complex agricultural land use pattern. And Kerala has also witnessed a major change in its land use pattern over the years. Some reports suggest that agriculture in Kerala, which historically is rice paddy wetland and agroforestry based, is on a decline. And the major reason for this is a shift from cultivation of food crops to non-food crops, and also the increase in the area under non-agricultural use. And these changes in land use and cropping pattern in Kerala pose a challenge not only to the food scarcity of the state but also to the ecological sustainability of the state. Under this is what is land use change. So land use change simply refers to the conversion of a piece of land's use by humans from one purpose to another. For example, land may be converted from cropland to grassland or from wildland to human-specific land uses. And certain type of land use change have well-known word associated with them, such as deforestation, afforestation, or rewilding. The next major topic is agricultural land use change. The changes in land use pattern and cropping pattern in Kerala poses a serious threat. And to include into it, the reclamation of paddy land and wetlands causes imbalance in drainage system, reduce water table level, and destroy flora and fauna inhabiting in that particular system. So it is clear from this that the imbalance in land utilization leads to food insecurity, and ecological instability in any region. Statistically speaking, the area under cultivation increased from 2.3 million hectares in 1960 to 2.9 million hectares during 1969. This in turn was associated with a dramatic rise in the coverage of rice crop. That is, between 1955 and 1970, rice area increased by almost 150,000 hectares. Since then, however, the total cropped area remained more or less stagnant. And there has also been a pronounced coconut and rubber boom. That is, coconut area increased by 106% between 1955 and 2000. Thereafter, it however stabilized. Likewise, rubber area expansion in the state for the 1955 to 2000 period was about 627%. And the other crops that gained substantial coverage during the same period included arecanut, banana, and plantains, However, cassava lost much of the area that it occupied in the early and mid 1970s. So overall, the land use changed to present an intricate pattern, especially in view of the wide variation in physical setting and the complex development patterns adopted in the past. Yet, a clear shift away from the food crop, mainly rice and cassava, in favor of tree crops such as rubber and coconut and some of the export-oriented cash crops such as pepper, ginger, coffee, cashew could be seen. And such shifts in land use may have profound implications for the food security of the state, which already depends on the outside supplies to meet more than half of its food grain requirements. And in addition to the conservation of the upland crops owing to socio-economic and technological commercial reasons, population growth and urbanization have led to a marked increase in clay mining and other non-agricultural use of the land, which further added to this situation. So the impact on forest ecosystems. Agricultural land use changes have impacted the forest ecosystem of Kerala in two major ways. That is, the first one is a conspicuous shrinkage of state's forest cover, and the second one is the loss of the structural integrity of the remaining forest. The first one, if we see the declining forest cover. So over the past 30-year period, over the past 30-year period from 1940 to 1970, there was a steep drop in the state's forest area with the cumulative loss of publicly managed forest. That is, the forest cover of Kerala dropped from 44.4% in 1905 to 14.7% in 1983, and an average 1% drop thereafter each year. And the four distinct phases of deforestation in Kerala are as given. That is, first one is the extensive conversion of forest land to plantations, following a royal proclamation in the late 19th century. Then the Grow More Food campaign of the mid 1970s, when substantial area of forest were opened up for the cultivation of food crops. Then the colonization during the 1950s and 60s, which created a new settlements in the deforested area, and finally the infrastructure development of the post-independence era, during which projects in power, irrigation, and transportation sectors were set up on forest land. So, shifting cultivation also was widespread in several parts of Kerala during and after the late 19th century. So, as the forests have declined at an unprecedented rate, especially in the highlands of Kerala, with its rolling topography and heavy rainfall, soil erosion continued unabated, leading to reduced soil quality and low productivity. According to the Kerala State Planning Board, there are about 14,76,000 hectares of degraded land in Kerala, of which about 950,000 hectares experience moderate to severe erosion intensities, diminished infiltration rates, and greater runoffs from catchment areas, flash floods, and high rates of sediment production in mountains. Mountain streams are also seemingly widespread. The recent landslides in Idki and Wayanad districts also have been linked or brought about due to these forest destructions and the changing cropping patterns, especially in the upland water. And the most important are the shrinking area devoted to cultivation of food crops and an increase in the rate of deforestation. So the land area used for rice cultivation declined from about 876,000 hectares in 1975 to 431,000 hectares in 1996, with the result that the local rice production barely meets one-third of the total consumption requirement of the state. Although no official estimate of the deforestation in Kerala is presented, it is widely known that in certain regions, large-scale conversion of forest area have occurred, contributing to concerns about the sustainable land use. So the next topic is the latest developments or changes that comes under land use change. In the post-flood scenario, floodplains and riverbanks should ideally be earmarked for agriculture rather than housing. The State Soil Survey and Soil Conservation Department has recommended the opposite things. The department has also called for a ban on cultivation on very steep slopes in landslide prone regions. These recommendations are a part of a 313-page report, the soil health status of Kerala in the flood post-flood scenario prepared by the department After a detailed study in 13 districts, which is except Kasargod, these 13 districts that are affected by the devastations of the 2018 flood. And the report was released at the recent Vaiga Expo organized by the Agriculture Department in Thrissur. The flood has affected the physical and also the chemical properties of the soil. So the topsoil erosion and sediment deposits have changed the soil characteristics in both upland and lowland regions. In fact, the flood washed away a significant volume of nutrient-rich topsoil through sheet erosion. So with the changing climate and changing patterns of rainfall, the behavior of rivers may also change, and they may deviate from their normal watercourse and flow through inhabited areas, as it happened during the recent flood times. So the land use policy has to be reformed in such a way to accommodate these changes. The floodplains and the riverbank should be exclusively demarcated for agriculture crops rather than housing. The very steep slopes of environmentally fragile areas have to be kept under thick vegetation and cultivation in these areas, which provoke phenomena like landslides, landslip, land subsidence, and so on, should be strictly prohibited. And to give an overview of what we have discussed till now, we can say that the land use changes in Kerala were unprecedented during the past half century. A substantial decline in the area under rice and cassava, besides the increase in coconut and rubber cultivation, are paramount in this respect. The consequences of deforestation, which also has been widespread in the state, include frequent flash floods, landslides, soil erosion, and silting of reservoirs, causing serious ecological and environmental problems and complex feedback effects on agriculture production. So, in the light of massive environmental degradation and the need for climatic change mitigation and the rising demands for fuel, wood, fodder, timber, agroforestry holds promise. However, very little extensive work has been done on integrated tree crop production system in the state. Further effort is therefore required to develop management practices in participation with farmers that will maximize the complementary interactions and resolve the location-specific constraints to spread the adoption of agroforestry technologies. Thank you.
My topic is destruction of ecology of Kerala through centuries. Introduction. Ecological destruction mainly depends on economic development. Unplanned development creates ecological problems in Kerala. Before 1990s, Kerala economic growth was less than that of national average. Now it is above that of national average. Due to unplanned development, we destroyed our fragile lands like paddy field, hill areas, mountains, forests, etc., and made a greater impact on climate, lifestyle, etc. The major incidents occurred due to the ecological destructions. The first one is flood that happened on 16th August 2018. It was brutally affected in Kerala. It is due to unusually high rainfall during the monsoon season. Over 483 people died and 140 were missing. About 1 million people were evacuated from different parts of our state, mainly from Changanur, Pandana, Edanad, Aranmula, Kolancheri, Airur, Rani, Pandalam, Kuttanad, Malappuram, etc. 14 districts of the states were placed on red alert. According to the Kerala government, 1/6 of the total population of Kerala had been directly affected by the floods and related incidents. Indian government had declared it a level 3 calamity or calamity of severe nature. It is one of the worst floods in Kerala after the great flood that took place in 1924. In this time, 35 out of the 54 dams within the states were opened for the first time in history. All 5 overflow gates of the Idukki Dam were opened at the same time, and for the first time in 26 years, 5 gates of the Malampuzha Dam of Palakkad were opened. The second incident that took place in Kerala during this time were landslides. Heavy rains in Wayanad and Idukki have caused severe landslides and have left the hilly districts isolated. Due to the changes in the rainfall, the hilly areas were affected by the landslides. The major landslide incident that threatened the Kerala was landslide happened at Pettimudi in Idukki district. This disaster looked like the landslide that happened in Kavalappara in Malappuram and Kuttumala in Wayanad. Around 76 people had been killed and missing in these landslides. The two factors contribute to landslides. The one is the static ones like the slope of hill or steep, and the other one is triggering factors which include anthropogenic activities like deforestation, construction or land use. The next one is factors that led to the ecological destruction in Kerala. The first one is colonial origins. Colonialism can be called by green imperialism. It was called by Richard Grove, an environmental historian. During 19th century, British had complete control over the Travancore, Kochi and Malabar. That is the present Kerala. They made attempts to clear forests and establish commercial plantation of coffee, cinchona and tea. For example, during 1877 and 1888 period, the British planter John Daniel Munro bullied the local ruler to lease him 144,000 acres of virgin forest in the Kannandevan Hills in Idukki region of the Kingdom of Travancore. This was over 3% of the total area of Travancore. Tropical forests were cleared for large-scale commercial plantations, first for coffee and subsequently for tea. Thus began the massive destruction of what the Madhav Gadgil Committee called the waterways of the southern Western Ghats. During the 20th century, starting of rubber cultivation in low-lying areas of the Western Ghats and the Midlands also affected forest and biodiversity loss across Kerala. Rubber occupies 28% of the crop area in the state today. The other one is migration impact. The large-scale internal migration from coastal and midland areas to the Western Ghats during first half of the 20th century and lasted till 1980 also contributed to forest destruction. A research study by the National Center for Earth Science Studies in Thiruvananthapuram has established a positive link between migration and large-scale forest destruction in Kerala. The settlement in the Idukki region of Travancore and Wayanad region of Malabar led to the extensive forest clearance for agriculture and human settlement. The third one is urbanization. Massive urbanization in the state led to forest destruction. 1970 to 1971, when Kerala's population was 1.69 crore, urban population was only 15.1%. But by 2050 to 2060, when the state's population grew to 3.34 crores, the urban population shot up to 47.7%. Kerala is today considered as a suburban or urban, that is rural plus urban state. Increases construction and infrastructure due to urbanization. Stone quarries increases up to 5,000, where 2,000 are situated at Western Ghats. The next factor is hydel projects. Our dependence on hydropower led to forest destruction. There are 35 hydroelectric projects out of 58 dams. This contributed destruction of over 350 square kilometers of evergreen forest in the reservoir area alone. Dams commissioned before 1971, they are unable to hold water as per their designed capacity because of silt. The next factor is sand extraction. Construction led to the increase of sand mining by the sand mafia. Excessive sand mining from the riverbeds has led to reduction in the water absorption and retention capacity of the riverbeds. Based on sand audits conducted in 14 major rivers, it is found that sand extraction is up to 85 times in excess of the sand deposition. In the 3,200 kilometer network of rivers, riverbeds capable of retaining and slowly releasing 500 million square meters of water at a time have been eliminated through sand mining. This has caused rivers to overflow not just to the floodplains but to the basins as well. The entire 38,863 square kilometer of Kerala's landmass is the catchment area or drainage basin of its 44 rivers and 900 tributaries. Many tributaries have been done to death. Thousands of flood paths consisting of small streams, rivulets, etc. have been leveled for construction. And the other one is destruction of backwater ecosystem. Kerala has a network of coastal backwaters, freshwater lakes, wetlands and marshes. They used to cover an area of 1,279 square kilometer or 1.28 million hectares. All the major freshwater lakes have shrunken up to one-fourth their original size. The story of 32 coastal backwater systems is no different. Two of the biggest backwaters, Vembanad and Ashtamudi, are protected wetlands under the Ramsar Convention. 6 rivers drain into the Vembanad Lake. Research studies have shown that Vembanad, which covered an area of 315 square kilometer in 1912, have now shrunk to 160 square kilometer, thereby losing half of the drainage area of 6 rivers. This has been a major reason for exacerbating the flooding in southern Kerala. Excessive tourism and urban development have contributed to the destruction of the wetland. Destruction of paddy lands and uncontrolled tourism. Though not strictly classified as wetland, the paddy fields in Kerala have played the role of floodplains in the state. Paddy lands in Kerala are low-lying areas into which water drains from the surrounding hills in the lands. About 80% of the paddy fields have been leveled or converted for construction and commercial cultivation, and only 1.9 lakh hectares remains. Thus, the entire water cycle, beginning with the water surveys in the Western Ghats to the village level, has been disrupted through ecologically unwise human intervention. After 1918, uncontrolled tourism development has also contributed to this disruption in the mountains and coastal areas. Ecological regulated tourism, rather than just branding megatourism as ecotourism, would be critical to preserving Kerala's ecosystem. The other factor is global warming. There is no direct evidence to link the 2018 Kerala floods to global warming, but there is enough corroborative evidence. Global warming will manifest in manifold ways, such as increase in cyclonic frequency or intensity and extreme precipitation. Globally, extreme weather events multiplied fourfold during 1996 to 2018 compared to the 1973 to 1995 period, resulting in increase in floods, droughts and wildfires. The other topic is environmental crimes and loopholes. Government and public are avoiding various environmental laws and environmental recommendations like the guilt reports, etc. Areas suffered maximum damage are in ecologically sensitive zones by Western Ghats Expert Ecology Panel. Idukki and Wayanad suffered most danger in the monsoon season. The majority of the 153 villages classified by ecologically sensitive zones in Kerala by the Kasturirangan Commission fall under these districts. The environmentalists said the people in these areas are paying the price for Western Ghats Expert Ecology Panel recommendation not being implemented by the state. Both the original Gadgil Committee and the subsequent Kasturirangan Commission recommended restrictions on construction activities in the ecological sensitive zones. However, illegal resorts started mushrooming in tourist spots in Idukki and Wayanad when the state government showed signs of bowing to pressure from the resort lobby and settler farmers led by Catholic bishops and priests. Scientists say indiscriminate construction in ecologically sensitive zones is a major reason for occurring landslides in the Western Ghats. In recent years, landslides have been occurring in Kerala frequently during the monsoon. More than 300 people lost their lives in around 90 major landslides between 1961 and June 2018. According to the plan prepared by the Kerala Disaster Management Authority, 14.4% of state's area is susceptible to landslides, which not only claim lives but also destroy homes and agricultural land. Most of the landslide prone areas are in the Western Ghats. So we have to check if the Western Ghats ecological report recommendations are implemented in their true spirit. If authorities realize these and act accordingly, Kerala can be saved from further disasters, said Dr. S. Abhiraj S. Assistant Professor of Atmospheric Studies at the QSAT. He added that human intervention shrunk floodplains across Kerala, thus affecting the absorption of rainwater. He said the recent amendment to the Kerala Paddy Land and Wetland Act permitting reclamation of paddy fields and wetlands for public interest projects may compound the problem. Conclusion: we need sustainable development rather than unplanned development. We need to protect the fragile lands for the future generation. We should strictly follow the environmental laws and various recommendations made by the various committees. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I am Taslina. I am going to discuss about the steps and suggestions for the conservation of fragile lands. Now I am going to discuss steps and suggestions for the conservation of fragile lands. Conservation of ecologically fragile lands, minimizing the reduction or degradation of the ecosystem and biological diversity is inevitable, which evolved through millions of years. It is considered necessary to manage such land in an integrated and uniform manner within their ecological boundaries in accordance with the management plan based on sound scientific principles. They exhibit the same degradation, growing terms of garbage and plastic, untreated sewage, chronic water shortage, unplanned urban growth, and heavy pollution from increasing vehicular traffic. The phenomenon will only exacerbate the impact of climate change. The following immediate intervention by all concerned state and required authorities should be taken. The first crucial step in regard is the adoption of Madhav Gadgil Committee report and its implementation. Next one is controls over the construction activities. Municipal bylaws to be amended were required to prohibit construction activities in areas falling in a hazardous zone or across alignments of natural springs, water sources and watersheds near urban settlements. There will be a strict enforcement of these bylaws, including through imposition of heavy penalties and compulsory demolition of illegal structures. Construction activity will be prohibited in catchment areas of cities, including along mountain, lakes and other water bodies. Their feeder channel must be kept free from the building activities. During the construction of roads, the plan for road construction must be take into account of the environmental fragility of the region. Environmental impact assessment should be made mandatory for the construction of roads. All state and national highways and expressways of more than 5 km length, including the extension and widening of existing road. This will not apply for the inter-village roads. Next one is prevention of quarrying and mining. It should be in an environmentally fragile areas. The maps of landslide vulnerable areas should be shared with public. Let them know about such areas. Next one is conservation of mangroves, coastal zones, waterways and other ecologically fragile areas. A strategic plan may be drawn up for leveraging the rich endowment of inland waterways. Dredging work must be taken up in both natural and artificial waterways. All mangrove forests need to be identified and management plans be prepared for their conservation. Every coastal zone should make their coastal zone map online and it's make available for general public. Next one is management of dam. The new conservation of dams in an ecologically fragile area should be prohibited or in accordance with the environmental principles. The management of dam should be more scientific during monsoon and it help to prevent more environmental destructions. Next one is spreading environmental awareness. Local festivals should be utilized for spreading environmental awareness, with the protection of environment being linked to local culture and festival. The environmental studies must be included in the curriculum of students from the early classes. Next one is stringent punishment for environmental crimes. It must be give awareness to people about the environmental crimes and their punishment, and award stringent punishment for the crimes. Next one is better preparedness for facing disasters. The final one is environment friendly lifestyle. Everyone must adapt a lifestyle like eco-friendly lifestyle, avoiding plastic bags and plastic bottles and other things which destruct the nature and environmentally fragile areas. Everyone should take a pledge for the conservation of nature and the fragile areas. Change in nature of use of land is a very debatable topic in nowadays. The law regulating the change in nature of use of land is very significant, especially in case of ecologically fragile and sensitive areas. The greedy approach of people destroyed the land. The exploitation destroyed the nature of land. It led nature of land to a vulnerable situation. Once Kerala was known for its scenic beauty, but the change in the pattern of use of land destroyed the ecology of Kerala. There are many ecologically sensitive areas are destroyed along with the food security of Kerala. About 80% of paddy field destroyed for the industrial growth. Forest covers of Kerala reduced to a larger extent. This vulnerable condition of Kerala ecology led us to environmental calamities in 2018 and 2019. The great flood in 2018 and 2019 destroyed the ecology of Kerala, and it reduced the nutrition-rich topsoil, caused the death of many people. And the environmental calamity, environmental disaster in 2 consecutive years reveals the pathetic condition of Kerala environment. From the 20th century, global community began to think about this environmental vulnerable situation of environment, and we have many of treaties and convention agendas in worldwide, like UNESCO's MAV program, Stockholm Conference Convention on Biological Diversity, and Ramsar Convention, and etc. This convention and treaties create a worldwide plan to protect and conserve environment and protect from the overexploitation of environment. In India, we have National Forest Policy from 1988, and our constitution itself imposes a duty to citizens to protect and conserve environment. In Kerala also we have many program for conserving environment, and the project Rebuilding Kerala was an example. It is an environmentally vibrant project after the flood and environmental disasters in 2018 and 2019. It's all about our presentation on fragile land and changing nature of use of it. Thank you all. Thank you for listening us.